The moment you feel most isolated is precisely when the spirit of lust strikes with maximum force. And this isn't coincidence. It's calculated warfare that exploits the vulnerable state of your heart when human connection feels absent. Divine presence seems distant, and the ache for intimacy becomes so overwhelming that counterfeit satisfaction starts looking like legitimate relief from the pain of being alone. Right now, across the world, believers are falling into sexual sin not because they're inherently perverted, but because they're profoundly lonely. And the enemy understands what most Christians never recognize: that loneliness creates a spiritual hunger that will seek satisfaction somewhere. And if you don't fill that void with God's presence and authentic community, lust will present itself as the solution to emotional emptiness, while actually deepening the isolation it pretends to cure. If you're tired of fighting the same sexual temptations that seem to intensify during your loneliest moments, and you're ready to understand the hidden connection between isolation and sexual sin that the church rarely addresses, you need to subscribe to Faith Ablaze Network and hit that notification bell immediately, because what I'm about to expose will reveal why your battle with lust always escalates when you're alone, and show you how to break the cycle by addressing the root cause rather than just managing symptoms of a deeper wound that's driving you toward sexual compromise. The shocking truth that most believers never discover is that Genesis 2:18 records God's declaration that it is not good for man to be alone before sin ever entered the world. Meaning loneliness itself is a condition that God identified as problematic even in paradise, and this divine observation reveals that human beings were designed for connection, created for community, and hardwired for intimacy in ways that make isolation feel like starvation, regardless of how many other blessings fill your life. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the enemy studies your design and weaponizes your legitimate need for connection by offering sexual gratification as a counterfeit substitute for the authentic intimacy your soul craves. And because lust provides immediate relief from the pain of loneliness through fantasy, pornography, or inappropriate relationships, your brain begins to associate isolation with sexual behavior until loneliness itself becomes a trigger that automatically activates lustful thoughts and behaviors that feel like your only option for escaping the unbearable weight of being alone. The second devastating mechanism through which lust exploits loneliness is the way sexual sin creates a vicious cycle where engaging in lustful behavior produces shame that makes you withdraw further from healthy relationships, authentic community, and vulnerable connection with people who could actually address your isolation, leaving you more alone than before, which then creates increased vulnerability to the next sexual temptation that promises relief from the very loneliness that your previous sin deepened. James 1:14-15 describes this progression perfectly when it reveals that each person is tempted when dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when full grown, gives birth to death. But what most people miss is that this death isn't just spiritual. It's the death of authentic intimacy, real connection, and the vulnerable relationships that God designed as the actual solution to human loneliness, while lust offers a cheap substitute that feels like connection but delivers deeper isolation. The enemy's strategy is brilliant in its cruelty. He uses your loneliness to seduce you into behavior that guarantees more loneliness by creating shame that prevents you from pursuing the real relationships that could heal the wound he's exploiting, keeping you trapped in a cycle where isolation feeds lust. Lust produces shame. Shame increases isolation, and the cycle repeats with intensifying power until you're so entangled that you can't remember what genuine intimacy feels like or imagine that freedom is even possible. The third hidden dynamic that explains why lust thrives during lonely seasons is how isolation distorts your perception of God's presence. Because Psalm 139:7-10 promises that there's nowhere you can flee from His presence. Yet loneliness makes you feel abandoned by God, forgotten by heaven, and left to navigate life without the divine companionship that Hebrews 13:5 guarantees when God promises never to leave you or forsake you. This perceived absence of God creates a spiritual vacuum that makes you vulnerable to any voice that offers comfort, any image that promises pleasure, any fantasy that provides temporary escape from the crushing weight of feeling alone in the universe. And the spirit of lust specializes in presenting itself during these moments of spiritual disconnection, as if sexual gratification can fill the God-shaped hole that only divine intimacy was designed to satisfy. What few believers understand is that their battle with lust isn't primarily about sexual desire. It's about the desperate attempt to medicate the pain of loneliness with counterfeit intimacy, because the authentic intimacy with God that John 9:45 describes as abiding in Christ has been neglected, compromised, or never fully developed, leaving you vulnerable to any substitute that promises to ease the ache of isolation, even when that substitute will ultimately deepen the very wound it claims to heal. The fourth shocking reality about the lust-loneliness connection is how Satan specifically targets believers during seasons when legitimate isolation is unavoidable. Late at night, when everyone else is asleep, during transitions when you're separated from familiar community, in new cities where meaningful relationships haven't formed yet, after breakups when the absence of romantic connection feels unbearable, or during seasons when ministry demands or life circumstances create necessary solitude that becomes dangerous when you haven't learned to transform isolation into intimacy with God. 1 Peter 5:8 warns that your adversary prowls around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And the enemy knows that isolated believers are vulnerable believers because loneliness amplifies every other struggle, magnifies every temptation, and makes you more susceptible to deception that you would easily recognize if you were surrounded by the accountability, encouragement, and spiritual support that Ecclesiastes 4:9-12 describes, when it declares that two are better than one, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken, meaning your spiritual strength is multiplied through community, while isolation makes you an easy target for attacks that would fail against believers who have the protection of authentic fellowship and vulnerable relationships. The fifth devastating aspect of how lust feeds on loneliness is the way sexual sin promises connection while actually destroying your capacity for authentic intimacy by training your brain to associate pleasure with isolation, fantasy, and the commodification of human bodies rather than with covenant relationship, emotional vulnerability, and the sacred design that Hebrews 13:4 honors when it declares that marriage should be honored by all and the marriage bed kept pure. Every time you use pornography, fantasy, or inappropriate sexual behavior to cope with loneliness, you're reinforcing neural pathways that make real intimacy less satisfying because you've trained yourself to prefer the counterfeit that requires no vulnerability, risks no rejection, and makes no demands for authentic connection over the genuine article that requires courage to pursue, grace to maintain, and the willingness to be fully known, which 1 Corinthians 13:12 describes as seeing face to face and knowing fully, even as you are fully known. The tragic irony is that people who struggle with lust are often desperately hungry for genuine intimacy, but have become so conditioned to accept sexual counterfeits that they've lost the ability to pursue or even recognize authentic connection when it's offered, leaving them perpetually alone while surrounded by people and constantly engaged in sexual behavior that promises intimacy but delivers deeper isolation with every indulgence. The pathway out of this destructive cycle isn't found through stronger willpower, better accountability software, or increased shame about your failures. It's found through addressing the root issue of loneliness by cultivating the kind of intimacy with God that Psalm 16:11 promises provides fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore in His presence, and through pursuing authentic community that Hebrews 10:24-25 commands when it instructs believers not to forsake assembling together, but to encourage one another daily. What most people never understand is that your battle with lust will continue to defeat you as long as the underlying loneliness remains unaddressed, because you're trying to fight a symptom while ignoring the disease, treating sexual temptation as the problem when it's actually the attempted solution to isolation that feels unbearable. And until you learn to transform alone time into intimacy with God through worship, prayer, and meditation on His Word, and until you develop vulnerable relationships with other believers who know your struggles and provide the accountability and encouragement that James 5:16 identifies as essential for healing, you'll remain trapped in the cycle where loneliness triggers lust. Lust produces shame. Shame creates more loneliness, and the enemy celebrates while you experience perpetual defeat in an area where God has already provided everything necessary for victory. The question isn't whether you'll experience loneliness. The question is whether you'll continue letting that loneliness drive you toward sexual sin that promises connection but delivers isolation, or whether you'll finally recognize that your hunger for intimacy is actually a God-given desire that was meant to draw you into deeper relationship with your Creator who. Psalm 68:6 promises sets the lonely in families and into authentic community with other believers who can provide the human connection you desperately need, while pointing you toward the divine intimacy that alone can satisfy the deepest longing of your heart. Because Romans 8:38-39 guarantees that nothing in all creation can separate you from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, meaning you're never truly alone, even when you feel isolated. And the moment you learn to recognize God's presence during lonely seasons and pursue genuine community rather than sexual counterfeits, you break the power that lust has been wielding over your life by removing the weapon it's been using to keep you in bondage. The lie that you're alone and sexual sin is your only option for experiencing the intimacy your soul was created to enjoy. If this message exposed the hidden connection between your loneliness and your battle with lust, subscribe to Faith Ablaze Network and hit that bell for biblical truth that addresses root issues instead of just symptoms. Comment what country you're watching from and share this with someone fighting sexual temptation who needs to understand they're not just struggling with perversion, they're struggling with unaddressed isolation that's driving them toward destructive counterfeits.